Today on All Things 80s, Luke Skywalker from Kenner. Welcome back to All Things 80s. Now today we're going to take a look at the different Luke Skywalker figures that Kenner produced between 1978 and 1985. Now Luke Skywalker was the most represented character that Kenner produced, and they made a whopping 7 different versions of Luke. So today we're going to take a look at each version, and at the end we'll rank them from worst to best. The original Luke Skywalker figure, who I refuse to call Farm Boy, was first available in 1978 as part of the early bird package. This is one of the most iconic figures out there, thanks in part to its extending lightsaber, which was quite an innovation at the time. When someone mentions Star Wars figures, chances are this will be the figure that immediately springs to mind. 1979 saw the release of the Luke Skywalker X-Wing pilot figure. The figure itself does look good, but really it could be any member of the Rebel Alliance, as it doesn't stand out as being Luke Skywalker. Now, given that he didn't actually yield his blaster when flying his X-Wing, it would have been nice if this figure came with a removable helmet in place of the blaster, but I have to assume that Kenner didn't have the capability to produce that back in '79. Now, one huge plus point about this figure is that he's one of the few in the entire line who actually has a sculpted hand that allows him to get a really good grasp of his weapon. So you have to therefore assume that he also had strong forearm muscles. Luke in his Bespin fatigues hit the shelves in 1980, and this was a fantastic looking figure. The figure represented great value for money as it came with 2 accessories, and given that most of us used to save our pocket money to get these figures, value for money was always a big consideration. The one quirk I could never understand as a child was the fact that his lightsaber hilt had been sculpted onto his belt, yet here he is, using his lightsaber. I guess Kenner just didn't really think that one through. Towards the end of 1980, we got Luke in his Hoth battle gear. I was always annoyed with this figure due to the fact that his stance reminded me of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Another point of frustration was the weapon he was packaged with. I don't recall him using a rifle in the movie, and the rifle he came packaged with could only ever be hoisted over his shoulder, as there was no way to fit it in his hand. With the release of the Return of the Jedi movie in 1983, we saw an influx of Kenner figures representing some pretty inconsequential characters. Fortunately, Luke Skywalker in his Jedi Knight outfit was not one of them. If the Bespin Luke represented value for money, this one took things into overdrive. In addition to the 2 weapons, he also came with a removable cloth cloak. Given that Luke was without his cloak in the majority of the movie, it's ironic that the tunic used on this figure was not at all screen accurate, yet 2 years later, Kenner released another Luke figure with the correct tunic. Luke didn't appear again until the release of the Power of the Force line in 1984, which continued to focus on characters from Return of the Jedi, with one exception, Luke in his Stormtrooper disguise. This is a figure that should have been released back in 1979 in place of the X-Wing pilot, but I suspect they simply hadn't developed the technique of producing these tiny helmets back then. This was an awesome figure, but it did raise one question: where's Han? Probably the best thing about this figure was that it allowed you to create a mini Stormtrooper army without buying a figure you already had. The final Luke Skywalker figure was released in 1985, and he came sporting a battle poncho. On the surface, this figure looks amazing, but when you try to remove his helmet, you start to feel a little short-changed. What makes this all the more damning is the fact that the card back depicts Luke without his helmet, yet the Leia battle poncho figure does have a removable helmet, yet the card back shows her with a helmet on. Finally, this figure should really have come with a lightsaber if Kenner had any intention of being screen accurate. So now to rank the figures, well, in last place I have the Luke in his Hoth battle gear. As I mentioned earlier, I just don't like the stance, and the fact that the rifle he came with is completely unusable as a rifle. Big no-no there. Next up is the Luke X-Wing pilot. Yes, it's a nice looking figure, but it's just far too generic. That could be any member of the Rebel Alliance and has nothing about it that says it's Luke Skywalker. I have the battle poncho Luke next, simply because his helmet doesn't come off. That was a big problem, and I don't know what Kenner were thinking with that one. Right in the middle of the selection, I have the Luke Jedi Knight. Great figure, great value for money, and anything that came with more than one accessory was always a bonus. Number three is the Luke in Stormtrooper disguise. This figure is fantastic on so many levels, but especially the fact that it could be used as a second Stormtrooper if you were doing sort of scenes with your figures. And I know, speaking from personal experience, when I had pocket money to spend on an action figure, I was not going to buy another Stormtrooper. I wanted a different figure. So as a kid, you had the option of buying a new figure that could still represent a Stormtrooper. Number two is Luke in his Bespin fatigues. I really do love this figure. Everything about it just looks great. Aside from the quirky hilt of his lightsaber attached to his belt there. Just wonderful looking figure, but number one has to be the original Luke Skywalker, simply because it's so iconic. This is the figure you think of when someone mentions Star Wars figures, and without question, that is number one. I hope you enjoyed that look back there at the different figures that were available, and tell me what you think of my rankings. Anyway, as always, I thank you for watching, and I ask you to please like, please subscribe, and see you in the next video looking at all things 80s.